The morning mist clung to the forest like a shroud as Martha's trembling hands gripped the rusted rifle. Through the gap in her weathered shutters, she counted them. 1, 10, 50, 100, 200. Silent warriors on horseback formed an impenetrable circle around her tiny cabin, their faces painted for war, their weapons gleaming in the pale dawn light. The old widow's heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the eagle feathers in their hair, the sacred markings on their horses. These were not raiders, these were protectors. But why? Her mind raced back to yesterday's humiliation, to the cruel laughter that had echoed through the trading post, to the decision that had changed everything. She pressed her back against the rough wooden wall, knowing that whatever happened next would either vindicate her shattered dignity or seal her fate forever. The lead warrior raised his lance toward her door, and in that moment, the entire wilderness seemed to hold its breath. But what happened next would silence the entire prairie. 24 hours earlier, Martha Henderson had awakened to another day of crushing solitude. The cabin that had once echoed with her husband's laughter and her children's voices now held only the whisper of wind through broken boards in the settling of old timber. At 63, her back bent from years of hauling water and chopping wood, she moved through her morning routine with the mechanical precision of someone who had forgotten what it meant to live rather than merely survive. The coffee was bitter, brewed from grounds she'd used 3 times already. The last of her flour sat in a tin that rattled when she moved it, barely enough for 2 more days of thin bread. Her reflection in the cracked mirror showed a face carved by grief and hardship. Silver hair escaping from a threadbare bonnet, eyes that had once sparkled with joy now dim with resignation. The photograph on her mantle, faded and worn from her tears, showed a different woman surrounded by a loving family. That woman felt like a stranger now. Outside, the forest pressed close against her windows, a green wall that had become both her sanctuary and her prison. She hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 weeks, not since her last desperate trip to town had ended in shame and empty pockets. Her stomach cramped with hunger as she rationed the last strips of dried venison, saved from the deer that had wandered too close to her snares 2 months ago. The trading post in Millfield was a 4-hour walk through treacherous terrain, but her cupboards were bare, and winter was coming fast. She counted the coins in her small leather pouch, 7 silver pieces and a handful of copper pennies, all that remained of the money from selling her wedding ring. It would have to be enough. As she prepared for the journey, tying her worn shawl tight against the morning chill, Martha caught sight of her husband's old coat hanging by the door. Samuel would have never let her make this walk alone, would have moved heaven and earth to provide for his family. But Samuel was 5 years in the ground, along with their 3 children, all taken by the fever that had swept through the valley like wildfire. She was alone now, forgotten by a world that had no use for poor widows who lived like ghosts in the woods. The walk to town stretched ahead of her like a sentence, but there was no choice. Survival demanded sacrifice, and dignity was a luxury she could no longer afford. The trading post buzzed with activity when Martha pushed through the heavy wooden door, her arrival barely noticed among the merchants, trappers, and townspeople conducting their business. She clutched her meager coins tightly, approaching the counter where Edgar Whitmore, the post owner, was haggling loudly with a customer over beaver pelts. When he finally noticed her, his expression shifted to barely concealed irritation. She asked quietly for what little she could afford: flour, salt, a small piece of bacon, maybe some coffee beans. The total came to exactly what she had, leaving her pockets empty but her pack slightly fuller. It was then that she noticed the commotion near the back of the store. A small crowd had gathered around something, their voices rising in mockery and disgust. Curiosity overrode her desire to remain invisible, and Martha made her way through the crowd. There, huddled in the corner near the stove, sat a young native woman, barely more than a girl, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Her clothes were torn and bloody, her left arm hanging at an unnatural angle. The crowd's taunts filled the air like poison. Savage, heathen, probably diseased. Someone should run her off before she brings her whole tribe down on us. Martha felt something stir in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. It was the same protective instinct that had once driven her to shield her own children from the world's cruelties. But her kindness would soon summon something far greater than gratitude. The girl's eyes met Martha's across the hostile crowd, and in them the old widow saw a reflection of her own desperation. Without thinking, Martha pushed through the jeering men and knelt beside the injured girl. "What's your name, child?" she whispered in the broken Cherokee she remembered from her childhood when her father had traded with the local tribes. "Ayanna," came the whispered reply, followed by a flood of words Martha could barely understand. The girl's was hurt, lost, running from something terrible. The crowd's mockery grew louder as Martha helped Ayanna to her feet, supporting her weight. "You can't be serious, Martha," Edgar Whitmore called out. "That savage probably killed some poor family. You're harboring a murderer." The other voices joined in, a chorus of condemnation and disgust. But Martha had made her choice. She guided the girl toward the door, her own meager supplies forgotten on the counter. "Come with me," she said softly. "You're safe now." The walk back to the cabin was slow and difficult, with Ayanna leaning heavily against Martha's slight frame. Every step was agony for both of them, the girl from her injuries, Martha from the weight of another mouth to feed when she barely had enough for herself. But as they walked, memories flooded back, memories of her own children, of nights when they had been hungry or hurt, of the fierce love that had driven her to sacrifice everything for their well-being. Back at the cabin, Martha tended to Ayanna's wounds with gentle hands and what little medicine she had left. The girl's arm was badly broken, and fever burned in her small body. Through broken phrases and gestures, the story emerged. Ayanna was the daughter of a Cherokee chief, kidnapped weeks ago by white trappers who had planned to sell her to the highest bidder. She had escaped during a river crossing, but not before enduring unspeakable horrors. Now she was alone, miles from her people, with no way to find her way home. Martha made a decision that defied all logic. She would care for this girl, protect her, heal her, regardless of the cost. She shared her meager food, giving the larger portions to Ayanna, whose young body needed strength to heal. She gave up her own bed, sleeping on the hard floor, while the girl recovered on her thin mattress. Days passed in a blur of fever dreams and whispered conversations. Martha's supplies dwindled to nothing. Her own body grew weak from hunger, but she persevered, driven by a purpose she hadn't felt since her family's death. Ayanna began to recover, her spirit returning as her strength grew. She taught Martha words in Cherokee, sharing stories of her people, their customs, their deep reverence for the earth and all living things. In return, Martha told her about Samuel and the children, about the garden that had once flourished where now only weeds grew. Two broken souls had found solace in each other's company, but their peace would soon be shattered. On the seventh day, the sound of horses approaching shattered the morning stillness. Martha peered through the window to see a dozen men from town riding toward her cabin, Edgar Whitmore at their head. Their faces were hard with righteous anger, their hands resting on their weapons. They dismounted in her small clearing, their boots heavy on the soft earth. "Martha Henderson," Whitmore called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Martha stepped out onto her small porch, her chin raised despite her trembling hands. Behind her, she could hear Ayanna's frightened whimpers. "She's done nothing wrong," Martha said, her voice carrying across the clearing. "She's just a hurt child who needed help." That child, Whitmore spat, is probably a scout for a war party. You've put the whole settlement at risk with your bleeding heart foolishness. The other men murmured their agreement, their faces twisted with fear and prejudice. We're taking her to the territorial marshal. Let him decide what to do with her. Martha stepped protectively in front of her door. You'll have to go through me first. The confrontation stretched taut between them. 12 armed men facing one elderly widow with nothing but her convictions to protect her. But his kindness would soon summon something far greater than gratitude. The standoff might have ended in violence, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats changed everything. The men turned toward the forest as the rumble grew louder, more numerous. Trees began to sway as something massive moved through the underbrush. Then they appeared warriors on horseback, emerging from the green shadows like spirits of the forest itself. One by one they came, until Martha's small clearing was surrounded by an army of Cherokee braves, their faces painted for war, their weapons ready. The townsmen's bravado evaporated as they found themselves outnumbered 20-1. At the head of the war party rode a man whose presence commanded absolute respect. Chief Running Bear was a mountain of a man, his weathered face marked with the scars of countless battles, his eyes holding the weight of his people's history. Eagle feathers adorned his long black hair, and silver bands circled his muscular arms. His horse, a magnificent black stallion, pawed the ground impatiently as the chief surveyed the scene before him. His gaze moved from the terrified townsman to Martha standing protectively on her porch, then to the small figure of his daughter visible through the open doorway. When Ayanna called out to him in Cherokee, her voice breaking with emotion, something shifted in the chief's expression. Here was a father who had thought his beloved daughter was lost forever, and an old white woman who had risked everything to save her. Chief Running Bear dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and dignified. He approached Martha, and for a moment, the old widow thought her last hour had come. Instead, the mighty chief stopped 3 paces away and did something that stunned everyone present. He removed one of his silver armbands, a sacred piece that had belonged to his grandfather, and placed it gently in Martha's weathered hands. Through Ayanna, who had emerged from the cabin despite her injuries, he spoke words that would echo through the valley for generations. My daughter tells me that when she was broken and alone, when her own people couldn't find her, a white grandmother opened her heart and shared her last food with a stranger. She tells me this woman chose kindness when the world offered only cruelty. His voice carried across the clearing like thunder rolling through mountains. Such courage deserves honor, not threats. Edgar Whitmore stepped forward, his face red with indignation. Now see here, Chief, this woman has interfered with white justice. That girl is a fugitive, and we demand. He never finished the sentence. With a gesture from Chief Running Bear, a dozen arrows appeared in the hands of his warriors, strings drawn taut, points aimed directly at the townsmen's hearts. The message was crystal clear. Another word of disrespect toward Martha would be their last. The chief continued his speech, his daughter translating with tears streaming down her face. In our tradition, when someone saves the life of a chief's child, they become family. This woman is now under the protection of the Cherokee Nation. Any who harm her will answer to me and to the spirits of my ancestors. He gestured toward his warriors. These men will remain here as long as needed to ensure her safety. They will hunt for her, protect her, honor her as they would honor my own mother. Martha felt her knees grow weak as the magnitude of what was happening sank in. The armband in her hands was warm from the chief's body, its silver surface etched with symbols she didn't understand, but somehow knew represented honor, courage, and family. "I don't need protection," she said softly, her voice barely audible. Ayanna translated her words, and Chief Running Bear's stern expression softened into something approaching a smile. "Grandmother," he said in careful English, "those who give freely when they have nothing to give deserve to receive abundantly. This is the way of the spirits." The townsmen, faced with overwhelming force and the chief's unwavering resolve, began to back toward their horses. Edgar Whitmore's face was purple with rage. But even he wasn't foolish enough to challenge an entire Cherokee war party. As they mounted and prepared to leave, the chief called out one final warning. "Tell your people that this land now remembers kindness. Those who bring harm to the grandmother will find no peace in these woods." As the dust from the retreating townsmen settled, Chief Running Bear turned his full attention to Martha. Through Ayanna, he learned of her losses, her struggles, her lonely existence in the small cabin. His expression grew more solemn with each revelation. Here was a woman who had suffered greatly, yet had still found room in her heart for compassion. He spoke quietly to his warriors, and immediately they sprang into action. Some disappeared into the forest to hunt. Others began gathering firewood and water. The chief himself, despite his exalted status, helped carry Martha's meager belongings back into the cabin, treating her worn possessions with the same respect he would show sacred objects. "My daughter has told me of your sacrifice," he said through Ayanna's translation. "You gave your food when you had none to spare. You gave your bed when you had no other. You risked your life when you'd already lost everything." He paused, studying Martha's weathered face. "In our culture, such selflessness creates a debt that can never be fully repaid, only honored." The old widow felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "I only did what anyone with a heart would do," she whispered. Chief Running Bear shook his head solemnly. "No, grandmother, you did what few would dare. You saw past fear to find love. You chose courage when the world demanded cowardice." And in that moment, Martha understood that her act of kindness had created something far greater than she had ever imagined. Sometimes, the smallest gestures of compassion could move mountains, or, in this case, summon an entire nation to stand guard over a lonely widow's door. The days that followed transformed Martha's lonely existence into something she had never dared imagine. True to their chief's word, the Cherokee warriors maintained their silent vigil around her cabin. They were ghosts in the forest, invisible unless she needed them, but always present. When she stepped outside each morning, she would find fresh game hanging from her porch: deer, rabbit, wild turkey, more food than she had seen in years. Her small garden, long neglected and overrun with weeds, was mysteriously tended and replanted with corn, beans, and squash. Water appeared in her well when it ran low. Firewood stacked itself neatly by her door. It was as if the forest itself had come alive to care for her. Ayanna remained with Martha as she healed, and through their growing friendship, the old widow learned about Cherokee culture and traditions. She discovered that her act of kindness had resonated far beyond what she could have imagined. Word of the white grandmother who had risked everything for a Cherokee child spread through the tribal networks like wildfire. Chiefs from distant villages sent emissaries to pay their respects. Elder women arrived with gifts, blankets, pottery, medicine plants, sharing their wisdom and accepting Martha into their circle of sisterhood. The transformation extended beyond material comfort. For the first time in 5 years, Martha felt truly alive again. She had purpose, connection, family. Ayanna called her grandmother in Cherokee, and the title felt more real than her own name. When the girl's arm healed completely, there was never any question of her leaving. She had found a second mother, and Martha had found the daughter her heart had been missing. The silver armband from Chief Running Bear held a place of honor on Martha's mantle, beside the faded photograph of her lost family. It represented something she was still learning to understand, the power of love to transcend all boundaries. The chief visited regularly, always with great ceremony, but also with genuine warmth. Through Ayana's translation, he shared stories of his people's struggles, their resilience, their hopes for peace with their white neighbors. Martha, in turn, shared her own stories, and slowly, a bridge of understanding formed between two worlds that had been strangers for too long. Winter came early that year, but Martha faced it without fear for the first time in half a decade. Her cabin was warm, her pantry full, her heart no longer empty. On cold nights, she and Ayana would sit by the fire, the old woman teaching English while the young woman shared Cherokee legends. Sometimes Chief Running Bear would join them, bringing other tribal members who wanted to meet the legendary white grandmother who had changed everything with one act of compassion. The townspeople of Millfield learned to give Martha's path a wide berth. Word had spread of the Cherokee protection, and no one was brave enough or foolish enough to test their resolve. Edgar Whitmore's trading post suffered as Cherokee traders began doing business elsewhere, taking their valuable furs and crafts to settlements that showed more respect for their protector's adopted grandmother. The economic message was clear. Kindness was not just morally right, it was profitable. Spring brought new visitors, a group of Cherokee elders led by the tribal grandmother, a woman so ancient and revered that even Chief Running Bear deferred to her wisdom. She had traveled many miles to meet the white woman whose compassion had become legend among her people. Through multiple translators, she spoke with Martha for hours, testing her spirit, measuring her heart. At the end of their visit, she performed a ceremony that Ayana later explained with tears of joy. Martha had been formally adopted into the Cherokee Nation, given a Cherokee name that meant she who sees with her heart, and granted all the rights and protections of a tribal member. The ceremony was witnessed by dozens of Cherokee families who had come to pay their respects. They brought gifts, shared meals, and listened as Martha told the story of her encounter with Ayana for the 100th time, each telling adding new details to what was already becoming tribal legend. The anniversary of that first day dawned clear and warm, a full year since Martha had first brought Ayana home from the trading post. The old widow stood on her porch, no longer bent with suffering but straightened with pride and purpose. The forest around her cabin was alive, not threatening but protective. Her Cherokee family was everywhere, invisible guardians who had never wavered in their commitment. Ayana, now fully grown into a beautiful young woman, stood beside her adopted grandmother. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Martha in perfect English, their shared language of choice now. "Giving up everything for a stranger?" Martha fingered the silver armband that had never left her wrist. "Child," she said softly, "I thought I was giving up everything. I had no idea I was about to receive everything." Chief Running Bear appeared from the forest as if summoned by her words. His presence no longer intimidated Martha. Instead, it filled her with the warmth of family. "Grandmother," he said, his English much improved over the year, "my people have a saying, the heart that shares its last grain of corn will never know hunger. You have proven this wisdom true." As the sun set over the forest that had once been her prison and was now her sanctuary, Martha reflected on the strange turns life could take. A year ago, she had been the poorest woman in the county, mocked and forgotten. Now, she was one of the richest, measured not in gold but in love, respect, and purpose. Her small cabin had become a meeting place between two cultures, a symbol of what was possible when people looked past fear to find common humanity. She was no longer just surviving, she was living, loving, making a difference. The Cherokee children who visited called her grandmother, and she taught them English while they taught her their games and songs. The elders sought her counsel on matters involving white settlers, recognizing her unique position as a bridge between worlds. She had become exactly what she had never expected to be: essential, valued, beloved. The story of Martha Henderson and her Cherokee family spread far beyond the valley, carried by traders and travelers to distant settlements. Some called it impossible, others called it beautiful. Church groups debated its meaning, while government officials worried about its implications. But for Martha, standing on her porch as darkness fell and the sounds of the protected forest filled the air around her, none of that mattered. What mattered was the young woman beside her who called her grandmother, the mighty chief who called her family, the hundreds of warriors who had pledged their lives to her protection. What mattered was the simple truth that had started it all. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness could change everything. She had risked everything for a stranger and discovered that strangers were just family she hadn't met yet. In choosing compassion over safety, she had found both. In giving her last grain of corn, she had inherited a harvest that would feed her soul for the rest of her days. The widow who had once been forgotten by the world had become unforgettable. Her name whispered with reverence around Cherokee campfires, and her story passed down through generations as proof that love was always stronger than fear. And so Martha Henderson lived out her days surrounded by the family she had chosen and who had chosen her in return. A testament to the truth that kindness is never wasted, compassion is never foolish, and love recognizes no boundaries of race or culture. She had learned that protecting the vulnerable makes us stronger, not weaker, and that the greatest treasures in life cannot be bought or sold, only given and received with an open heart. When she finally passed away many years later, surrounded by her Cherokee children and grandchildren, her funeral was attended by hundreds who mourned not just a woman, but a symbol of what the world could be when people chose love over fear. Would you have risked everything for a stranger's child? Would you have opened your door when the world demanded you close your heart? Her story challenges us to examine our own capacity for compassion and asks whether we have the courage to see family in every face, home in every heart. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this and click on the video on the screen to watch the next one with a twist so powerful you'll never forget it.